Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, October 26th. My name is Ardita Karai, and on behalf of Toronto Agile community, I would like to welcome today our presenter, Lee McCallum. I also want to thank our volunteers, Peter Jakes and Paul Henman, for helping us organize and set up this webinar today. So a little bit quickly, what's going to be today, the agenda for today. And you probably, if you have attended our webinars before, you probably know we have a question box where you can ask questions. We usually keep all the attendees in ear-only mode because we want to avoid any external noises. And if you have any issues with the audio, please try to log in again or try another browser. Before we go ahead, I really want to say thank you to all our sponsors. These are the sponsors for our Toronto Agile Conference that is coming up, but they are also sponsors to all the webinars that we are running and will continue to run every month for you. So without them, we will not be able to run this webinar, so thank you. A little bit about our speaker today, Lee. So Lee is a solution architect at IntelliWare, which is one of our sponsors, and I tried to ask a lot of his friends about, hey, tell me some fun fact about Lee, but everyone says, you know what, the topic that he's going to talk about today, that is his hobby, that's what he likes to do. So I think we have found the right guy for the right conversation today. So Lee is going to talk about redefining technical debt, aligning business and technical initiatives. And with that, Lee, I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Thanks, Artie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, it's so true. Like, this is something I've been really excited to share with the Toronto Agile community, and I'm looking forward to feedback on a couple of ideas that have been spinning around my head for a few years. And the title is Redefining Technical Debt, Aligning Business and Technical Initiatives. And really, those are the two ideas. The one is this idea that there's business initiatives and there's technical initiatives, and they often aren't aligned. And I think the business loses as a result of that. And I'll get into the specifics as to why I think that's the case. And I think at the core of that loss is that there's no kind of unifying terminology, and it feels like if we were to tweak the definition of the term technical debt, we can actually get there. Most of my career has been as a developer, over 20 years, but more recently I've had roles in project management and even business ownership. And so I think with that kind of deep experience in development, I kind of bring, and on the flip side, the business side, I bring a unique perspective to the topic, and I'm hoping to kind of bridge that gap. So what are the two perspectives? I think primarily the business really wants the features that they want developed as fast as possible, and sometimes they'll kind of push very, very hard and crank it through to a fault. And as we all know, kind of the formal, kind of informal definition of technical debt is that if you push too hard with the business side of things, technical debt incurs and you end up losing on velocity. On the flip side, developers want to work smart, not hard. And by doing that, by working smarter, not harder, they can actually do that also to a fault. Where, and we'll get into it in a minute, but basically optimizing their environment to the point it could actually end up wasting money for the company. And so, kind of an optimal balance is ideal here. An interesting thought experiment around, you know, why this imbalance is here is around continuous integration. If we look at businesses, let me see. If we look at continuous integration, sorry, one second. With our existing processes, if you look at continuous integration, would it actually come up naturally as a part of our Agile process or not? It's an interesting thought process to think, would that actually occur? Would developers be able to identify that they need this thing called continuous integration to make them more effective? Would the business be able to understand what continuous integration is? Do they have to understand it? Do they understand the value that it brings? And would they be able to get that into the backlog, for example, for the business to advocate for actually putting that in place? And I would say that that's not the case today, and really we should be there, or we should be striving to get there, and that's just a little thought experiment, something to think about. So back to the extremes of kind of business focus versus optimizing work environment, I actually had the opportunity early in my career to experience both cases firsthand. So I was on a model-driven architecture project in the early days of my career. And basically the idea at a very, very high level, I've got a little diagram here. Ideally, the business can model and change the requirements of the system on their terms, in their language, and the system basically supports that development from, say, business analysts. You would deploy the model and the exercise the business did to the system, and then dynamically the interface would be created, the data model would be created, everything would be taken care of technically. And then basically that they can update and change the system for their end users. And this is kind of at the high level, at the core of the model-driven architecture, is to basically give the business the simplest of tools to accomplish the most that they can. But as you can imagine, this endeavor is quite complicated when you get into the details. And the key point here about, I was saying, the early days and technical having everything they wanted. In this project, it ran for about three and a half years while I was there. And basically, let me back up a little bit about the initiative. It was a company that had a flagship product. It was built in COBOL. It had a good footprint in the market space that it was at. They had great sales, great customer relationships, and everything else. But with it being COBOL, they were looking for the next best thing. And so there was an internal research initiative with about 7 people on average over about 2 years that were building out the system. Sorry, it was over 3 years. But for the first 2 years, the business basically had faith that we had to do all of this prerequisite work to get this complex architecture in place. So for that first 2 years, it was effectively a technical initiative. There was no business value produced at all. So we were spending time optimizing our work environment, optimizing how we worked, coming up with different designs that'll satisfy aspects of the business model getting to the system, and all this kind of stuff. And so it was kind of a heyday. You can see the little guy with the pizza there. It was a lot of fun, but after a year and a half and you're still not providing value, you realize that you got to hit the ground running. You got to start producing value now for all this effort that you put in, but you've done it kind of outside of context. So that was the technical focus side, and then all of a sudden we hit the I believe it was a rational unified process project, and I wasn't in project management at the time of this project, but it felt like we hit the construction phase of the rational unified process, which was about kind of let's start cranking out the work. We've done some prototyping, we've vetted everything, we've got to hit the ground. So a year and a half, 2 years later, we started to grow the team from 7 to over 50. And you can see in this diagram here, it's actually got very complex, very fast. We had core developers who were building out the semantics to allow for the modelers to do their modeling work. And as you kind of incremented on, giving the modelers or business analysts kind of more ability to do what they're doing, we had development effort that also had to follow suit. And so there was a lot of integration between model developers developing the extractors for the models, core developers changing the runtime engine, the business analysts using all three, including the UI work that the UI developers did. They're building out the base business models, basically, from which the customer would extend. we've got quality assurance, lots of different environments, very, very, very complex. But the understanding was it was highly business focused now. It was we had to deliver features now. We've done the prerequisite work, we've done the technical stuff, we delivered no value in a year and a half. And then all of a sudden we have to be business focused. Now the problem here was that we had to, there was no really account for technical debt or efficiencies or anything like that. It was expected that we can just hit the ground running and start now cranking out features. And that's at the very core of what I'm talking about in the presentation, is that there is still this gap, that this balance doesn't exist. Moving forward to the analysis, please excuse my my MS Paint skills here, but I think it illustrates the point for me. So that, and my daughter said that she loved this one, so I thought I'd keep it in. On the left side is what actually happened on this project. So if you look on the left, we've got effort, so say 0 to 100% effort spent, and then time, say 0 to 4 years, right? In the red is the technical delivery. So we spent 100% of the first half of the project on purely technical delivery, delivering the infrastructure, delivering all of the tools and that to actually build this very complex product. And again, team size about 7 or 9 for the first 2 years. And then we started to, and there was no feature delivery at the time, as I said, and then we started to pick up the pace with the feature delivery, and we were pushing hard and spending more and more time very quickly focused on feature delivery alone, at the detriment of the technical side of things. So things like optimizing scripts, optimizing how people work, you know, discovering, for example, that where all these models are extracted to actually should be in one place rather than in separate places, and being able to have the agility to be able to tweak that and change it so that it's easier on the analysts and the UI developers and everybody else. So you need, in flight, you have to be able to constantly identify and harvest these optimizations and feed it in, but really no time was allotted for any of that. So you start not working very smart. And so in the green is the actual delivery of business value. And so even though we were 100% focused on feature delivery for the last year or two, it was more and more effort to provide little and incrementally little business value. So you can see that curve kind of come down, and so our velocity is decreasing, and because of the amount of technical debt that's incurred. If you contrast this with the right side, if there was a way to listen to the development organization, listen to the efficiencies that needed to be had, and to be able to adjust in real time, the technical side would always have had a focus, especially in with this level of complexity that was on this project. Maybe it might be, 30% of the time is still spent on efficiencies, rather than, some people will come up with a number like 5% should be spent on technical debt. Maybe this project is special enough that it needed constantly, around 30%. But what's that balance? We still don't really have a way to figure that out yet, as far as I know with Agile. So technical delivery goes down. Feature delivery is constantly on the rise and basically in balance with the technical delivery. And the key is in the green, are delivering of business value. I mean, as the technical side, for example, introduces a new semantic that the business needs, and the business analyst team actually increases and can leverage that semantic in all sorts of new different business requirements, you may actually see a project acceleration. I mean, we've never talked about that in Agile. We talk about project velocity, but if you actually got this in balance, could you actually get to the point, of a bit of acceleration? I mean, who knows? It feels feasible to me. I'm interested in your feedback on that. So hopefully that illustrates more of the gap that's there. That before it was all technical focused, and basically the business had faith on what was going on. After it was highly business focused and technical debt incurred like crazy. And the business ended up getting less of what they could have had. So these divergent interests, the fact that the technical people want to work smarter, not harder, maybe to a fault, but maybe not. And the business wants their features almost to a fault. at the expense of the efficiency sometimes of development, it's a lose for everybody, for both the business and the technical side. Looking at Agile, it doesn't seem like there's much to say on the Agile side of things. I think we've came a long way. 30% projects would succeed back in the day, and Agile has brought us well up from that, where we succeed more regularly. But have we met the perfect balance? If you look at all these terms in the word cloud, it's not talking about debt or developer efficiencies, and I think that's where the next step is in the Agile movement. I had a look at Safari bookshelf across a lot of Agile project management books to try and see what do they say about technical debt and developer efficiencies, and surprisingly, there's not very much said that I could find. I did find a little bit around how you would say, spend 10%, 5%, and allocate specifically that to a project to work on technical debt, but that's not well informed. Like I was saying earlier with that MDA project, maybe 30% was the right balance at a certain point in time. How do you strike that perfect balance so that the business optimally gets the value that they're paying for? It's hard to say at the moment. And like I was saying, Agile doesn't seem to have much to say about that. It's very focused on business requirements. When you look at where does it fit within Agile, it seems to best fit in the backlog. You've got that single backlog of work items that the team works on, and certainly if it's on the scale of a day or two, it would have to go through the backlog. It's not something a developer could work on otherwise because they're allocated feature work. The other place it fits is the definition of done. So when a story is complete, we'll have certain contingencies or certain criteria after which a story has to be complete. The code has to be formatted in a certain way. Test coverage has to be a certain height, that kind of stuff. And so that helps to ensure that technical debt isn't incurred, but there still is chance for problems there. With respect to efficiency, technical debt, there's one thing that's missing, I think, with respect to the current definition of the term technical debt, and that's the passage of time. So in some circles, technical debt is avoidable. You can do work on a feature, and you should be able to strive to make it perfect. But if time goes by, and for example, we've upgraded from Java 1.4 to 1.8 over many years, and the code hasn't changed, I would argue if you have to go and maintain that code, there is a certain form of debt that's there. It's not using the latest of Java features. It's not as trim as it could be. The quality isn't as high based on today's standards. And the developer at the time who developed in 1.4 couldn't have done any differently. Yet there is debt there that kind of grows in the project as time goes by. In the same respect for business requirements. If I've got a business requirement that I'm implementing against, and it's as it stands today, the language of the code that I use is in perfect tune with what the business requirements are, and then time goes by and the business requirements change, there's kind of implicitly a debt that's there now in the code because it mismatches what the business has. So technical debt, I would argue, is not an avoidable thing, and I think we should broaden that definition to really just encompass all things around efficiency. So even the smallest thing like renaming a class, you could argue, is really about efficiency. If the name is incorrect or isn't quite precise or explicit, it costs time and money to actually, more time and money to understand what it actually is and to refactor it accordingly. So that's an interesting thing I'd love to hear back from the community, is that can technical debt be just efficiency and nothing more, nothing less? I would say bugs and that kind of stuff, we don't need to have that in the bucket of technical debt because that's already in the purview of the business. The business knows and values that bugs are fixed, and they'll want that, and they're okay talking about that. They can relate to those things, but they can't as easily to technical debt. So the problem with putting technical debt in the backlog is it leads to constant detailed conversations. So if you look at an upgrade to Java from 1.7 to 1.8, for example, if I have that in the backlog and I say I want to spend a day on the project to get this upgraded, the business is used to talking about stories in terms that they understand, right? So the stories relate directly to what features they want, and they're happy to talk about that, and they can use their intuition to prioritize it. When it comes to technical debt, you're talking two different languages almost. For a developer to say they need to move from 1.7 to 1.8, they have to get into very, very detailed conversations. And there's just a mismatch really there, and the business has to make a call. Okay, do we spend the day on this technical feature that's a day, or do we not do this business feature, or should we spend the time on this? And I think often what happens is the business just does it based on faith. It's based on maybe the shade of red of the face of the developers talking about it. It's just, if they're really passionate about it and they feel they really need it, then maybe they'll say okay, but otherwise they think okay, maybe it's not important, so they don't do it. How do they get that right balance? That there's no real forum or language to actually strike that balance well. As an aside, this kind of faith-based management of efficiencies, and what I'm calling technical debt, I was on as a business owner of a small startup company doing mobile app development. We had a marketing executive come in. Now, none of us knew anything about marketing, and she came in and presented to a number of stakeholders and presented a plan that was about $120,000, which is a ton of money for a small company. And it was a marketing plan, basically. And one of the stakeholders made a great comment, and he said, the only thing that this guarantees is that we're out $120,000 in 2 or 3 months. And another one chimed in, and they said, there's no feedback loop. Why is it that why don't we spend, say, a few $1,000s and see if that marketing initiative works, or that campaign works, and then iterate on that and actually grow that campaign if it works well. And if another one doesn't, then we don't. So at least we can adjust course. But the plan that we had in front of us didn't do that. Now, neither of them were marketers, and neither was I nor other colleagues that were in the meeting. And so we just went on faith that she knew better than us that that's what we had to do. We ended up spending, I think it ended up being $90,000, and we ended up with nothing. It provided literally zero value. And we didn't trust our gut. We just went with faith because, well, we don't understand. And that was the wrong decision in hindsight. Trust your gut. And I think in the same respect, tech debt is too much. The business just thinks, okay, well, the developers know what they're doing, so they trust in blind faith and just go with it. And that happened in my MDA project in the beginning. To spend 2 years and to deliver no value in a team of 7, I'm sure people in the business felt that there was something wrong with that, but they trusted that the technical folks knew better. It was a bad approach then, and I think that this marketing was an interesting example of how you really shouldn't just go on faith alone. You should go on more than that. So I'm going to go through an example of a detailed conversation just to show how this works. So I talked earlier about upgrading Java from 1.7 to 1.8. There's a lot of benefits that can be had around this upgrade. Sorry, developers know that there's intuitively that this is beneficial, but the business would have no idea that this is beneficial. So you can dive into specific examples, and you kind of drive the business into this around Lambda expressions and maybe illustrate, well, okay, if we go on the Java 1.7 side, which is on the left side, this is what the code looks like currently, but if we upgrade to 1.8, that can be simplified, and it can be simplified no more on the left side. But with 1.8, we can simplify it to what's on the right, so it's more explicit and less verbose. Less code means less maintenance, and that's better for all of us. The same with Stream APIs, an independent feature that's in 1.8. They can illustrate visually that there's less code, basically, as a result of going from 1.7 to 1.8. And for a developer to make the case to a business person, they feel as if they have to get into the details of all of why it's good to actually share their intuition with the business. And it becomes laborious for the business to actually have to go through this exercise as well, looking at code snippets, and they'll just go based on faith and their gut feel to say, okay, well, what percentage of time do you need this Lambda expression or the Stream API? And then, tens of minutes go by talking about this thing and whether to do it or not, but still the business will never have the intuition that developers with tens of years of experience have. So that they're not really seeing eye to eye, but they're both forced into this conversation in, say, a backlog review session to figure out, should they do this now or should they do it later? As far as I know, there's no other exercise to basically help quantify this in terms that the business can relate to. So the developer comes out and says, well, the upgrade benefits are productivity, we're happier and happier, we get motivation, momentum, quality increases, maintainability. And the business gets a sense that, well, maybe there's project velocity implications due to what the developers are telling me, legacy tech risk migration. So if, I don't know, Java goes out 15 years from now and something else comes in, then keeping up to date is in their interest. If, say Java 1.7 gets expired, later down the road, and they're forced to migrate at that time, cheaper long-term maintenance, performance. So they get a sense for these things, and it kind of centers around efficiency, but how much? And those conversations about how much don't come in play, and I think often because it's quite hard to do, but I don't know that we really even attempt to quantify it in business terms, and that's what you'll see me propose. Another example, so I've only got 2 examples, is generating boilerplate code. So oftentimes, the people at the floor, at the ground level actually coding this work will find that they're repeating, for example, the same patterns over and over again. And even though it's different code, it's not duplicate code, it's still essentially the same pattern that's being cranked out. And so a developer, working on this stuff may, if given the opportunity, may propose that we should actually have some kind of code generation, kind of explicitly or effectively implicitly, to reduce the amount of code that's written, to reduce error, and to increase our productivity. And so the key there is that the developer has to be afforded the opportunity to speak up, to say they're doing something that they can actually improve upon themselves. And as an example of this, I've actually ripped off a Lombok example. But I mean, pre-Lombok, this would be totally an efficiency that could be had in product development, where on the left you've got data example and you've got a number of attributes and a number of methods that have to be written. If one were to author a data annotation and say a setter annotation and create that themselves so that effectively what's on the left is produced behind the scenes for free, then all of a sudden as you have new objects, you only have to write 3 lines of code, not the 20 that's on the left for every single new object type. And if that's happening a lot, then that significantly reduces the code, which increases maintainability and again gives the business what they want in a faster way. But to actually get into, for a developer to get this prioritized with the business, they'd have to drag the business through this detailed example of why they want to get some time to actually write, to author this data annotation for them and this setter annotation for them. And again, the business is getting drawn into this detailed conversation. They have to make a judgment call of, okay, do we spend a day or 2 actually authoring this piece, or it'd probably be a bit more than a day or 2, but does the cost outweigh the benefit? They have no idea. It's just kind of based on faith and like I was saying, the shade of red of the developer's face, right? So again, the benefits, they get a sense for it, prevents the development of tedious work, reduces bugs, fun, interesting work. That's also a plus for efficiency, right? I mean, a motivated development staff is a productive one. On the business side, there's positive velocity implications and cheaper maintenance, but again, efficiency in a nutshell, but how much? There's no real sense or gauge for that. So as I was saying, Agile, it seems if you follow Agile, you put these technical items, they somehow make their way into the backlog, say from the development staff. In the backlog review, you're forced into the detailed conversations that work well for features that the business understands and they have an intuition around, but for technical stuff, the business doesn't have that intuition around it. And so they have to get into the details and try and make a judgment call, and it's really hard. So what I would propose is, if there was a way, and I'm not saying this is easy, but conceptually this seems to make sense. If we spent a bit of time trying to cost a Java upgrade and say, if we upgraded from 1.7 to 1.8, here's the cost, say it's a day of work. And in the context of a sprint, we're going to save a half a day. So across the entire team, we're going to save a half day of effort. But in the context of the release, which we're already budgeted for, we'll definitely get that back in reduced maintenance and reduced lines of code. It will be more effective to the point where it's actually in our interest to do this in the context of a release. And I think if you simplified it in these terms, if it was possible to simplify all technical debt items in the backlog in these terms, then the business can make a call to say, well, you know, we've you know, in this next sprint, we actually have to fit in a number of other items, and I see that, you know, if we put it in, we're going to get the benefits of the release, so we do want to prioritize it really soon, maybe for whatever reason, not this sprint, but the very next one. They're motivated to get this thing in because they know they're going to get back the benefits of this thing and more. And so it'd be nice to be able to have this simple conversation and not get into the technical debt, the technical details, but actually just get into the cost benefit of technical debt on a debt by debt basis. So the code generator one maybe is something different, where the cost, you know, is a day of effort, but you actually get back 2 days of effort immediately in this coming sprint, because of the fact that we've got a relatively large team and we're putting out, say, 50 of these objects. And rather than cranking out all this code, which is going to be a maintenance burden, it's actually going to be much easier to do with this code generator, so the data annotation, for example. And we know that. Doing that analysis to actually find out here's the cost and here's the benefit, we don't do today. But if we could do it, then the business can talk in much simpler terms and they can make a call. Again, in this one, it feels like a no-brainer. If you spend some time on this and you're going to actually get back that efficiency right in this sprint, then you would do it, right? Maybe there's a circumstance in which you won't, but I think you would. Whereas if we didn't have this type of conversation with the business, how do you convince them that this is a no-brainer? The developer knows it, but they can't kind of articulate it in a way that that resonates with the business, that allows them to do their job in prioritizing the backlog. So in general, what I'm talking about is just simplifying technical debt conversations, making technical debt just relate to all efficiencies that are from developers, and speak about it in terms of cost and what the return is, say, on a sprint and on a release basis, so the business has what they need to make the decision in a most effective way that they know is actually going to benefit them. So this is about kind of, again, bridging that gap. So before it was all faith-based, whereas now the business is informed on the trade-offs that are going to be incurred by leveraging the developer intuition put forth in terms of cost and a rough kind of estimate of, you know, sprint and release payback. The further point on this is that maybe a business has to get out to market, and they see that in the longer term, like in this case, the cost is relatively high, and over a couple of releases, it's actually worth it. But they have to get to market and validate that, you know, that whatever they're building actually is going to make enough money to fund the next releases. Then they'll make the trade-off and say, well, no, we're not going to do this debt in this case, right? So I think in order to get here, we have to support developer harvesting and identification of technical debt. Right now, I don't know that there's formal processes specifically around encouraging developers to find inefficiencies in how they work and work smarter and faster, especially across the team. I think individually we're quite good at that, but things across the team, like getting an data annotation in where otherwise there was none, say there was no Lombok and we wanted to author that ourselves, a forum to identify and actually get that in to improve efficiencies across the team, it doesn't really seem to be there in Agile thinking. So we need to open up time and space for developers to do this stuff and identify efficiencies. And furthermore, we need to allow them to estimate the return on investment on these technical debt items of the backlog. And by, you know, again, simplifying it so that the business doesn't have to get into the technical details, but they can make a call based on the intuition and judgment of the developers on when this feature is going to pay back. And there's all sorts of ways. It's not just about lines of code, therefore it's this much time spent writing it. It's about maintenance. It's even about attrition and stuff. Like if you lost your star developer because they're not working smart, which most developers want to do is work smarter, not harder, and they're forced because they're so inundated by feature work, they can't actually work smart on the job. There's a risk that they'll leave. And if that developer leaves, what's the cost to the business in getting someone else on board and getting them up to speed on the system and getting them developing? I would imagine you could do kind of a rough judgment call on that and factor that into the costing out of a technical debt item. So there's a lot. If you push hard, you can actually put it in terms of efficiency and roughly a cost benefit. Like let's say Lambda expressions on 1.7 to 1.8 upgrade is I don't know, very, very conservatively half an hour a sprint of gain per developer. If you've got 10 developers, then that's 5 hours of work saved. And if the upgrade only takes 3, and that's just on the authoring of this stuff alone, never mind all of the other risks, it becomes a no-brainer. But you have to do that exercise to come up with those numbers. So simplifying the conversations for the business allows the business to make the right call, allows the developers to get behind that call and understand why a trade-off is being made, and it prevents having to get into the technical conversations I was talking about earlier. So as an example of how we could manage this debt, if we took say a 3-sprint cycle, in one respect it talked about definition of done. So obviously we don't want to have 1 hour or less or 2 hour or less items in our backlog and have a backlog review meeting talking about such small pieces. So definition of done and maybe fix me comments should cover that kind of stuff. Fix me comments really I think are best done at the end of a sprint. There should be no fix me's. That's about kind of work in progress, things identified that must be done to attain definition of done. You can use things like Sonar to help with ensuring the quality of the code and the conformance to an agreed to definition of done. In story tasking, I think along the way as developers do their work and they're in the details of the code, they'll see problems, but they're cursory to the story in question. So it's just kind of on the side. And if they started doing that work, then the story would blow out and they wouldn't be able to hit the end of sprint deadline. So I think it's important to encourage them to write to-do comments for things that are relatively small scales, say renaming something, for example, that's outside of the context of the work they're doing. And then when a story comes along that actually would hit on that, there should be some discovery work first when estimating the story to see, okay, what's the implication of this? And you can gather the to-dos that are there and then estimate that in a tasking effort to figure out what's all the tasks that are needed to complete this story. And so that's how you can kind of clean up this other kind of cursory technical debt that's in the code. Then the other part is about actually opening up some time to do some harvesting. Have a regular meeting, say in week 3, where you meet with all the developers and you just ask, the question, how can we be more efficient? Maybe it's about, introducing continuous integration. If somehow it's not there, I think it's pretty standard that it's there these days, but it's along the same thing where there's some innovative ideas that can be pulled forward by developers to actually improve their efficiencies. And through that exercise, estimate, the cost benefit of, say, continuous integration, for example. That's a bad example, but and then the business in the context of their backlog review is simplified. They can just look at it and say, okay, it's going to take a day to do, but we know we're going to get 2 days back in the context of this sprint. So we're going to actually prioritize that, and they'll more aggressively actually prioritize that. Whereas I think before it's a bit more of a struggle to say, this thing is actually important without the language of, just talking about all of these efficiencies is just technical debt, and having a simple process around harvesting that technical debt and helping the business make the right choices for them. And so in conclusion, I've talked about. I don't want to repeat myself too much here. Let's see. Yeah, so the gaps remain. So the developers, again, focused on the technical side of things. They want to work as efficient as they can, smarter, not harder. Businesses want their features, and there's this strain between the two, and there's still a gap, I would say. Even though we've got DevOps and things that are helping, you know, bring developers to be more efficient and happy in their environment, there still is a gap between getting the business to actually choose to say, I want this technical initiative because I know it's going to make you efficient and by how much. Agile doesn't seem to say much about this, but I'd love to hear from everybody, the Toronto Agile community, to find out if it does. Is there a different fit for it? Is there a different way to approach it? Is this simplification of the language reasonable? If we can close that gap, that would be a win for both the development side and the business side. Encourage and empower developers to actually harvest and quantify this stuff. I think in a lot of projects, the business is so focused on the feature side of things that the fact that the developers they have the tools in their hands to optimize their own environment. Like they can build software to actually create software, build tooling to create better software and faster. If they're actually able to leverage this to increase their efficiency, the business will get more of what they want faster. And again, simplifying the conversations with the business so that they're not dragged into the weeds. I think sometimes even technical debt has it kind of becomes a dirty word in some organizations because the business doesn't want to be dragged into this stuff, and maybe they'll avoid it, so they'll just concentrate on the business side of things, and technical debt something else that they don't concern themselves with. But if it's taking up a couple of days to sprint on their backlog, I guess that sometimes they'll put just a percentage and say, okay, well, technical folks, you can have 3 days of sprint. But maybe optimally, actually 10 days of sprint is what would be better for the business. But those conversations don't seem to be being had. And that's about it. I used a couple of source snippets from a number of web pages, so I just wanted to source them here, and the fact that I'd used the Lombok data annotation for my example. Code formatter I used as well. And yeah, there's my email address there. So it'd be great to hear feedback from everyone on this idea. So I'll open it up for questions now, Ardea.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so far we don't have any questions, but since you are open for conversations from community, I can start with something until the rest of the attendees probably can come up with something. Okay. So I was listening, really curious, and there were some examples that you brought, and you called that an Agile project, where you were saying, well, Agile doesn't have much to say because it looks for business requirements. Or it is based on faith to develop just
being
developers.
Red in the face.
Or a process. We need a process to identify the efficiency, or discussing about there is no something that Agile says about cost of a developer leaving the company and stuff like that. I'm gonna probably bring a little bit of my experience on Agile projects, and this example that you're bringing makes me believe that there were strong silos on that organization, and there was not a good communication between business and IT, because I have seen in other Agile projects developers and business having a good conversation and talking openly to a point where both sides understood each other. So we moved from silos and from what's in it for me to what's in it for us. That conversation about talking the cost of a developer leaving a team, that is covered by knowledge sharing and by code being having a shared ownership, a lot of collaboration. There is nothing based on faith, and there's nothing based on just business requirements, but we use user stories, or we use hypotheses and experiments. So I have had experience where Agile projects using just simple tools like collaboration, desire to understand each other's point of view, and experimentation, and XP practices. So putting all the strength of the XP that comes from Agile has given me a different perspective on the issues that you are finding. So would you say that your Agile projects that you are referring there have been real Agile projects, or were they trying to do those practices and somehow created other problems?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't, I would say, a real Agile project. I mean, they claimed to follow a rational unified process, but they weren't. I think the three tenets are architecture-centric, use case-driven, iterative, incremental, and they were missing that use case-driven part. And so I don't think they got it. And this was a long time ago. This was about, 17, 18 years ago when I was on this project. So I think the whole we've moved forward, but I thought it was a decent illustration of kind of the worst case on both sides, when the technical side gets too much of what they want and the business side gets too much of what they want.
So
and sorry, one more thing. I've also experienced a positive side actually on my most recent project here right now, where because our client is actually quite technical, they've got an intuition and they're empowered to basically make the decisions on behalf of the business. These conversations actually aren't too bad. They're not too painful because it resonates with them immediately. They have that intuition both on the business side and the technical side, so it ends up not being too much of a problem. There's kind of a thought exercise though, but if you're in a case where there is that distinct difference between the business and the technical, and you're trying to bridge that gap, I think that was the sweet spot that I was looking for with this one.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm pretty sure that people that are listening are probably trying to steal some ideas here for their projects, for their Agile projects. So anything that you have seen from your other experiences that has worked well and has given you a better example on how this bridge was built and how business and IT, for example, you're mentioning this project you are right now. Any example there where a conversation was easier and was
Yeah, I guess for most of my career, it feels like I'm always trying to do the right thing for the business, but there's something in the way. And I just realized that in part it's kind of because of the language. I guess it was as a developer, for the first 12, 13 years of my career, it was always this struggle. I didn't have that perspective of a business owner or a project manager or the business side or someone non-technical. But then whenever I had the role on the other side, saw it from that different perspective, I realized that there was kind of a language problem. I wasn't talking in terms that they would understand, and that's why I never got the efficiencies that I felt needed to be in place, that were self-evident to me, but just couldn't get going. And it felt like ROI was one way to kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah, that's
it's been a constant struggle for me. It's like through my whole career to kind of say, this is what you want to spend your time on. It's a difficult thing to be able to convince customers that they should spend time on stuff that isn't directly related to feature work for their product or software that's under development, that actually spending time on these other things is also important, and here's specifically why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely that idea that developers are from Mars and business is from Venus sometimes, doesn't it?
Yep. And the business is losing as a result of not prioritizing these things in some respects, or like the reverse, that they're actually spending too much money on software that then they actually need to get the value that they need.
Mm-hmm. Have you been able to use any experimentations or spikes or technical practices like XP or DevOps or all of these? Have you seen any change from your experience on how an Agile team now can benefit from these?
I haven't yet, but I'm keen on trying this exercise. I think it's a difficult one to actually do, a return on investment sort of analysis on a piece of technical debt. Actually, I did do it in the past. In this project, actually, the MDA project I was talking about, I had real difficulty convincing management to get me help. Basically, I was the only person doing technical debt. So this was before DevOps existed. So I supported this entire team of 50, the full pipeline, all the environments, all the scripts, did some development work and everything. And it was a real crazy time, and I went through the exercise to try and cost out all of these things. So that was the last time I tried to do that.
That must have been painful.
What was that?
That must have been painful.
Oh, it was, yeah. It was. I felt like I had no choice. I was just drowning in the amount of work because it was hard to go home knowing that if I spent 4 hours writing tweaking a script, I would save the team a week of effort in the context of just one sprint. Just like it's a no-brainer, you just do it. And so I just was doing it constantly because it was required. And as the team was growing and the demands and the complexity of the code actually changed, we had to keep on top of this because if we didn't, it would just come to a complete halt. That's where I was at, and in desperation, I took the 100 items in my backlog and worked with actually a Six Sigma expert and asked him to come help me to produce some kind of a report to kind of prove the value that I'm bringing. And interesting enough, it was a benefit of 5 times my salary that I was bringing in optimizations, and this was very conservatively, and that was a quantitative number that I was able to come up with on all of the efficiencies that I had in the backlog. And interesting enough, that represents about 10% of what the cost of the project was. And I think that's how DevOps is kind of formed, is that roughly 10% of the operating cost of your software project should be dedicated to DevOps. It's kind of a 1 in 10. So it actually matched pretty closely with that number.
So what are your thoughts around, we're hitting around it, we're going around it, but what are your thoughts on the fact that developers need permission from business to do their job right? I mean, things that we are talking about here, keeping your tool set up to date, writing better code, optimizing and refactoring your code. These are things that developers should do, just like a plumber does their job right and has their tools right. These are the things that developers should do. Why are we in a place where developers need to ask permission for this? Why do you think we have come to have these conversations if developers are not doing their job?
It's a good question. I think the assumption is, through definition of done, they are doing exactly that, right? Each individual developer is working as optimally as they can and as smart as they can. I think the difficulty comes when it comes across developers and across the entire product. For example, if you're working on a product and you're upgrading from Java 1.7 to 1.8, that isn't a developer concern, that's a project concern. And it may take, say, a day or two to do, so a developer doesn't have the bandwidth to be able to do that on their own, nor should they be able to do that on their own outside of the purview of the rest of the team and even the business owner. So how do you, when a developer has identified an inefficiency that cuts across the entire project, how do they, and it takes a day or two or more to put that in place, what's the forum for which they raise that concern and the business actually advocates for doing it? Because the business is faced with an option, like in the context of a sprint, they're used to maybe getting all 40 points or whatever is all business-related points, but now we're saying, take out this 3 points worth of feature work and actually put in this technical debt work. It becomes a harder conversation, but that's the only way you can get 3 days of effort to open up. You know what I mean?
Have you experienced the experimentation when it comes to technical tasks like these? So probably experimenting on a sandbox first, and then make it all spread around all the teams. And I don't know if you have tried or has it worked for you or
Like spike solutions and that?
yeah, prototyping or testing a couple of things before we go and we say, hey, we're going to take those 3 points out of the sprint because we're going to do this to go there with a conversation that we have tested something before or
Like you mean specifically with this process? Have I tried to do this process and test it against a real project?
yes.
Yeah, I haven't. I hope for an opportunity to do that and go through it and actually experiment to see where it works and where it doesn't. Because I think DevOps has helped to bring the development organization much farther than the early days of the project that I was talking about. But I think there's still kind of our ways to encourage developers to bring forth this stuff and estimate it. And I definitely want the opportunity to kind of, again, make business and tech both happy and aligned.
Yeah. Yes. Well, great. Thanks for your insights. Thanks for your examples. Good conversation. I'm sure there was something for everyone to get out of this.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the presentation for you for 1 more minute.
Okay.
So thanks, Lee, again. Just for our community, for people that are still with us, here it is, our session, but give me a sec. Something coming up, it is the Toronto Agile Conference, and we warned you last time that we are really selling out quickly and registration is open. Well, we are now sold out. So the conference is in less than 2 weeks from now. We are sold out. So hopefully you have a ticket and you're going to join us. We are looking forward to a great event with everyone on our community. For anything, just as usual, please send us a feedback and suggestion on future topics that you would like to hear on our webinars. We are usually running these every month, so there is always room for something that is going to help you on your challenges at work. Stay in touch with us. Our website is always updated with the latest from us. We have also a newsletter. You can subscribe to it to get the updates on your inbox, and follow us on Twitter. That's where we are noisy and we talk a lot about what we're doing. So thank you again for being with us on this, and hope to see you at the conference or on our next webinar. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Lee.
Bye. Thanks.